The Atomic Gambit podcast is produced by the JFK Library Foundation and made possible with the help of a generous grant from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation. Also, in the interest of clarity, we have enhanced the quality of some of the archival audio, including secretly recorded meetings from the White House that you'll hear in this episode. Some of the audio may still be difficult to hear. We have full transcripts of each episode available on our website, jfklibrary.org/Atomic Gambit.
After the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest moment the world had come to a global nuclear war at the time, President Kennedy issued a new call to American leaders and leaders around the world.
It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression. We are not helpless before that task, or hopeless of its success. Confident and unafraid, we must labor on, not towards a strategy of annihilation, but towards a strategy of peace.
But despite the hope of a path towards peace, world leaders would confront new realities.
Once the ability to destroy each other in 29, 30 minutes was a reality, we had to start thinking differently about how we handle everything about nuclear weapons, from diplomacy to operational planning.
Some survived,
but the one man who survived was Fidel Castro and his regime in Cuba, and partly that is the result of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Others did not.
Khrushchev was commander-in-chief. The way how he handled the Cuban crisis exposed the Soviet army to a sort of humiliation that neither the Russian army during the Tsarist time, nor the Soviet army during the entire period of the Soviet history was exposed to.
And now, 60 years later, the world finds itself on the edge of a new nuclear crisis.
And now we're seeing, another terrible war in Ukraine, and the risk of a, nuclear exchange and possibility of nuclear weapons being used.
The lessons of how we survive the next crisis may be found in the legacy of the last. This is Atomic Gambit, the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years later. Episode 6, We Are All Mortal. Eight months after Soviet Premier Khrushchev's failed atomic gambit that brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear Armageddon, President John F. Kennedy addressed the next generation of world citizens in a commencement speech at American University. Up until the crisis in 1962, there was a prevailing opinion that whoever held the most nuclear weapons would be the victor in a nuclear conflict. The resulting crisis in Cuba put that idea into serious doubt, and President Kennedy outlined a new blueprint for diplomacy in the nuclear age. He delivered a strategy of peace.
Today, the expenditure of billions of dollars every year on weapons acquired for the purpose of making sure we never need them is essential to the keeping of peace. But surely the acquisition of such idle stockpiles, which can only destroy and never create, is not the only, much less the most efficient, means of assuring peace.
Before the crisis, Kennedy had shown his willingness to accept the argument that stockpiling a nuclear arsenal was the surest means of preventing nuclear war. In his campaign for president, he criticized the previous administration over the supposed missile gap and argued for increasing the American arsenal to keep pace or exceed the Soviets. Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and JFK biographer Frederick Logval says Kennedy had good reason to think that nuclear proliferation was a necessary option.
John F. Kennedy was among those who imagined that the world would be full of nuclear powers. So he said often to his aides, country after country is going to pursue a nuclear weapons program. Many of them will acquire those weapons. And by the way, there was good reason for him to believe that. There were far more countries around the world who in the early 1960s and beyond were planning to acquire nuclear weapons themselves.
But after being brought to the brink of nuclear war that could have destroyed not only cities, but entire countries, Kennedy's words began to turn against any suggestion that a nuclear war could be won. Instead, he said peace must be the answer.
Too many think it is unreal, but that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings.
In the speech, Kennedy described the path towards peace as an attainable goal.
This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression. We shall be prepared if others wish it. We shall be alert to try to stop it. But we shall also do our part to build a world of peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just. We are not helpless before that task or hopeless of its success. Confident and unafraid, we must labor on, not towards a strategy of annihilation, but towards a strategy of peace.
Only 8 months removed from the crisis, the speech was heard around the world. Even Khrushchev, his adversary, found the message so important that he ordered it to be reprinted in Russian across the Soviet Union.
Khrushchev ordered that the text of Kennedy's speech be made available to be printed for all Soviets to see, for all Russians to see. That tells us something about Khrushchev's thinking, that he wants to meet Kennedy where he is going with this speech.
The speech resonated in Kennedy's administration, and its ideals became something future administrations strove for as they engaged in their own nuclear diplomacy.
For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
But how did Kennedy's words translate into an actionable plan to preserve the peace? Could the two sides come to any meaningful agreement? Coming up, we'll talk about how both Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiated another peace that some say saved the world a second time.
There is so much we can learn about today by going back and digging into the stories of our presidents. My name's Lillian Cunningham. I'm a reporter and host at The Washington Post. And that idea is what inspired my podcast, Presidential. It's a journey through the lives of every single American president. From President Kennedy to lesser-known early presidents like Millard Fillmore, each reveals a lesson about our country's history. Listen to Presidential and other Washington Post shows wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, I'm Alan Price, director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. As the director of the library, I get to oversee the work of our dedicated archivists, museum staff, and educators as they work every day to share the information they find in the library with the public. Are you listening to our podcast wondering if there's more to the story? Well, you can find out yourself how deep the story goes by exploring our resources here at the John F. Kennedy Library. If you want to learn more about what you've heard today, we have links to the JFK Library's archives, including photos, films, and primary source documents. We also have oral history interviews from some of the key members of the team advising President Kennedy during and after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Visit jfklibrary.org/Atomic Gambit to get started.
After delivering his American University address in June 1963, President Kennedy once again pursued a nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union. Finding an agreement had been elusive since the UN Nuclear Disarmament Commission first brought the nuclear powers, the United States, United Kingdom, France, Canada, and the Soviet Union, to begin negotiations on ending weapons testing in the mid-50s. In the early 1960s, scientists discovered radioactive deposits in food and elsewhere as a result of nuclear fallout from weapons testing in the atmosphere, on the ground, and over the oceans. There was an increasing pressure to stop the oncoming environmental destruction. At the start of his presidency in 1961, Kennedy voluntarily started a moratorium on United States atmospheric testing in hopes of setting an example of what a test ban treaty could look like. Unfortunately, by August 1961, the U.S.-Soviet relations were at a new low after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion and a difficult summit in Vienna. The Soviets resumed air testing and conducted 31 tests, including exploding the largest nuclear bomb in history, a 58-megaton bomb 4,000 times the size of the bomb used in Hiroshima. Historian Tim Naftali said at a JFK Library forum in 2009 that while Khrushchev was also for some sort of test ban treaty, he was against any that would require verification by foreign inspectors.
The Soviets really wanted arms control, but they were afraid of verification. You see, if you're the weaker state, there's a disincentive to allowing the greater, bigger, more powerful state to see how weak you are.
But after the Cuban Missile Crisis and the worldwide acclaim for Kennedy's peace speech, the tide of public opinion against ever-increasing nuclear arsenals may have opened a window for both leaders to come to an agreement. In the summer of 1963, the president had been engaging Khrushchev in secret back-channel negotiations with British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan and Kennedy's representative Averell Harriman, the former Soviet Union ambassador during World War II. Serhiy Plokhy, author of Nuclear Folly, A History of the Cuban Missile Crisis, says the Americans were surprised at the sudden willingness from the Soviets on a test ban agreement.
Khrushchev had to show something for that, and he turned out to be much more agreeable to the American demands and American interpretation of what the test ban treaty should be about.
After only 12 days of negotiations, the group agreed on a partial ban of testing in the oceans, air, and outer space. The group compromised by continuing to allow underground testing. Only underground tests required on-site inspections. In this way, the Soviets could agree to the ban while keeping foreign eyes out of their nuclear facilities. The president addressed the nation on July 26, a day after the historic agreement was announced, and almost 2 decades after the only atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan.
18 years ago, the event of nuclear weapons changed the course of the world, as well as the war. Since that time, all mankind has been struggling to escape from the darkening prospect of mass destruction on Earth. Nor does this treaty mean an end to the threat of nuclear war. It will not reduce nuclear stockpiles. It will not halt the production of nuclear weapons. It will not restrict their use in time of war. Nevertheless, this limited treaty will radically reduce the nuclear testing which would otherwise be conducted on both sides. It will prohibit the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and all others who sign it from engaging in atmospheric tests which have so alarmed mankind. And it offers to all the world a welcome sign of hope.
The president received thousands of messages supporting the treaty. Some were from families hopeful it would make the world a safer place for their children. Others hoped it would be the first of many decisions to keep the world away from another crisis like Cuba. In one note, a citizen wrote to President Kennedy calling the agreement the most hopeful event since the end of the Second World War. The Senate approved the treaty 80-19, and Kennedy ratified it on October 7, 1963, almost exactly a year after the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Serhiy Plokhy says Kennedy and Khrushchev saved the world a second time on the day the test ban treaty was signed.
And that was the last major international agreement that was signed by President Kennedy before the assassination. Extremely important agreement on a number of levels.
The Test Ban Treaty was the last chance Kennedy or Khrushchev had to make progress on the strategy towards peace. President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas on November 22, 1963, just over a month after the ratification of the Test Ban Treaty. Khrushchev was ousted by his party the following year in 1964 and replaced by his protege, Leonid Brezhnev. While the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis would go down as one of Kennedy's biggest foreign policy successes, the end of the crisis did not have the same effect for Khrushchev in Moscow.
His close ally during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Minister of Defense of the Soviet Union, Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, went to his military brass to explain why he supported the coup against the commander-in-chief. Khrushchev was commander-in-chief. His explanation was that the way how he handled the Cuban crisis exposed the Soviet army to a sort of humiliation that neither the Russian army during the Tsarist time nor the Soviet army during the entire period of the Soviet history was exposed to.
According to Plokhy, the military was embarrassed in the way the crisis was resolved. They were particularly upset about having to leave Cuba with their ships' hulls exposed. But for Plokhy, the main reason for Khrushchev's ouster was not the end of the crisis, but his atomic gambit itself.
He was accused not of making a bad deal with Kennedy. He was accused by his colleagues when they were removing him from power, first of all, of provoking the crisis that could lead to the nuclear war, so adventurism. That was one accusation that was used against him, and another one that by the way how he handled the crisis, he spoiled relations with Cuba, an essential, very important, not just ally of the Soviet Union, but also the communist ally.
While Kennedy and Khrushchev disappeared from the world stage shortly after the crisis, Fidel Castro remained in power for decades. Michael Dobbs, author of 1 Minute to Midnight, Kennedy, Khrushchev, and Castro on the Brink of Nuclear War, explains.
But the one man who survived was Fidel Castro and his regime in Cuba, which survived for another 5 decades. Castros were still in power, and the system that they put in place on the island is still entrenched in power in Cuba today. And partly that is a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
One idea that did not survive the crisis into the next half-century was the premise that any country could win an all-out nuclear war. Tom Nichols, a professor at the Naval War College and Cold War expert, says the theory of a winnable nuclear war was no longer a realistic option after political leaders stared down the barrel of a gun in Cuba.
And I think that for policymakers, there might have been some sense that whatever that interregnum was from 1945 to about 1960, that once the missile age arrived, that we had to do things a little differently. That once the ability to destroy each other in 29, 30 minutes was a reality, we really had to start thinking differently about how we handle everything about nuclear weapons, from diplomacy to operational planning.
A few months before he gave his speech at American University, President Kennedy laid out one of his greatest fears of further nuclear proliferation beyond the two superpowers.
I'm haunted by the feeling that by 1970, unless we're successful, there may be 10 nuclear powers instead of 4. By 1975, 15 or 20. I see the possibility in the 1970s of the President of the United States having to face a world in which 15 or 20 or 25 nations may have these weapons. I regard that as the greatest possible danger and hazard.
Those fears were shared by Kennedy and Khrushchev's successors, Lyndon B. Johnson and Leonid Brezhnev. It became an election issue in 1964 when Republican candidate Barry Goldwater was much more aggressive when it came to the use of nuclear weapons, including advocating using tactical or small nuclear devices in Vietnam. In response, Lyndon Johnson ran what might be one of the most terrifying and effective political ads of modern times. The ad, called Daisy, reflected the immense fear that had overcome the country over the use of nuclear weapons since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
2, 3,
The ad features a girl in a meadow counting flower petals.
7, 6, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8.
Then a missile countdown.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
And lastly, a giant mushroom cloud takes over the screen, followed by the voice of Johnson.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
4 years after Lyndon B. Johnson's Daisy ad propelled him back to the White House for a second term, the U.S., Soviet Union, and the other nuclear powers agreed on the historic Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968. The agreement was the first of several commitments by the nuclear powers to work to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons.
And as the moment is reassuring, so it is even more hopeful and heartening. For this treaty is evidence that amid the tensions and the strife and the struggle and the sorrow of these years, men of many nations have not lost the way or have not lost the will toward peace.
It is still the most widely accepted arms control agreement in the world. In the following decades, the path towards a world with fewer nuclear weapons between the U.S. and Soviet Union would continue to be rocky. But there were some hopeful developments. In 1972, amidst growing unrest in both countries, both governments agreed to a cap on nuclear arms for the first time. Tom Nichols says the agreement between President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev was historic.
And interestingly enough, it's a Republican anti-Soviet hawk, Richard Nixon, who can step forward and say to the Soviets, look, we can't get rid of these things, but we can certainly cap the numbers. We can cap the volcano, as Henry Kissinger said. And I think that was a sober realization that even the Soviets, whether they liked it or not, understood that it was in their interest not to just keep grinding out nuclear weapons and trying to make plans for a war that no one would survive.
Despite the cap, both countries still had thousands of nuclear warheads that could destroy the world multiple times over. The dangers of nuclear weapons continued to weigh on the public's minds. In 1983, ABC television premiered a movie called The Day After, which centered around the Midwestern town of Lawrence, Kansas, in the lead-up and aftermath of a nuclear war. The program was estimated to be watched by more than 100 million people the night it premiered, and it remains one of the top TV movies watched all time.
Here's what's happening. Most of you who watched the ABC movie The Day After are probably still feeling just a little numb right now. Maybe you discussed
the fear of a nuclear threat depicted in programs like The Day After would add political pressure on both countries to do something about their large arsenals. In 1987, the two nations agreed to not only cap their nuclear arsenal, but for the first time to reduce and destroy thousands of their missiles. But now, as we enter the second decade of the 21st century, many of the agreements made in the past 60 years since the Cuban Missile Crisis are either endangered or have already been tossed aside. Tom Nichols sounds the alarm, saying the further removed the United States and its politicians have become from the Cold War, the more unsafe the world has become from keeping nuclear arms under control.
Where I think we failed is that after the end of the Cold War, we simply forgot about nuclear weapons and we just pushed them off the table and said, it's a problem that'll take care of itself.
As the world's dominant superpowers and nuclear powers, Nichols says the benefit of the old conflict between the United States and Soviet Union was that you could make sense of it.
In a way, the Cold War, as strange as this will be to say, was somewhat reassuring because you had two players who knew the rules of the road. And they had established channels for communication. They had well-worn paths that they had traveled from 1962 and even before onward, they knew what to look for. They each understood the other's body language about things like alerts and military kind of big muscle movements in their military. In the 21st century, we don't have a lot of that. We have new players in the game. We have a deeply unstable regime in Russia. We have an ascendant China that is much more prone to taking risks than it might have been in an earlier time.
In a world where Russia and the US are no longer the only major influencers on the nuclear stage, Nichols says today's problems could be as dangerous as where we were in 1962.
With the advent of the missile age, where our ability to react has been shaved from hours to minutes to seconds, and in the information age, where the amount of time we have to digest information has gone from days to hours to minutes and even to seconds, I think it's even more dangerous than ever.
Nikita Khrushchev's granddaughter and professor of international affairs at the New School, Nina Khrushcheva, agrees that there was a strange security in the arrangement of the checks and balances between the two superpowers during the Cold War. After the United States no longer had the Soviet Union as its chief national security threat, she doesn't believe the world necessarily became safer. In fact, she says things may have become more unpredictable.
When there was still the two superpowers and they were all in competition, they really felt the need to make sure that there is parity and balance of power, and kind of they need to have checks and balances on each other. But after 91, it stopped. And, as you remember, people started withdrawing from treaties quite soon after. So I think in 30 years, they forgot what dangers are there.
What challenges face us in a world where the technology to build a nuclear device is available to any country or person with access to the right materials? What can the Cuban Missile Crisis' legacy teach us in the 21st century? We'll answer those questions next after the break.
Hello, my name is Rachel Floor, and I'm the Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. Are you enjoying Atomic Gambit? This podcast is just one of many initiatives, programs, and resources supported by our foundation. The JFK Library Foundation is a nonprofit that provides financial support, staffing, and creative resources for the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. Learn more about the JFK Library and Foundation at jfklibrary.org. And if you want to join other supporters just like you, you can donate at jfklibrary.org/donate.
If only one thermonuclear bomb were to be dropped on any American, Russian, or any other city, whether it was launched by accident or design, by a madman or by an enemy, by a large nation or by a small, from any corner of the world, that one bomb could release more destructive power on the inhabitants of that one helpless city than all the bombs dropped in the Second World War.
In JFK's speech at American University in 1963, his words from nearly 60 years ago describe the nuclear arms control challenges facing leaders in the 21st century. His fear that more countries would gain nuclear capabilities in the half-century after the Cuban Missile Crisis came true, although not as many developed it as he first thought. Today, the Arms Control Association recognizes 9 states as nuclear powers: the United States, Russia, United Kingdom, France, India, Pakistan, Israel, China, and North Korea. Because the status of nuclear countries by the association is determined through the public, it's possible there are more countries who have not disclosed their weapons capabilities. Historian Michael Dobbs says part of what made the Cuban Missile Crisis more manageable in 1962 was that there were fewer countries with nuclear weapons.
Now at least a dozen countries have nuclear weapons, And I think the leaders are different too. I mean, one of the qualities that President Kennedy shared with Khrushchev was that both men had witnessed war at first hand.
Whereas the information needed to build nuclear weapons were highly classified state secrets in 1962, today access to that information is far more accessible, according to Tom Nichols.
But I think to some extent, this was a combination of the end of the Cold War and the inevitable progressing of technology to the point where, a lot of folks are going to learn how to make nuclear weapons.
In 2022, the obstacle to building a nuclear device isn't about knowledge, but a question of materials.
The challenge for making a nuclear weapon in the 21st century is not the plans and the theory, it's the engineering. Getting the fissile material and engineering the parts, that's the hard part.
Since the signing of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, the International Atomic Energy Agency has worked with nuclear countries to make sure their weapons-grade materials are secure. The United Nations organization also works with non-nuclear states on developing peaceful uses of nuclear technology, such as power plants. But the organization only has power as far as states are willing to allow it access. In the case of Iran, the U.S. and other Western powers made an agreement to loosen economic sanctions on the country in exchange for cooperation in the verification of its nuclear programs, and to put in place policies to keep Iran from becoming a nuclear weapons state. The Trump administration exited the agreement in 2018. However, as of August 2022, the Biden administration has engaged in talks to potentially re-enter a new deal. In highly politicized atmospheres, negotiations between nuclear states depend even more on positive diplomatic relations.
I hope that there is a way for the Chinese and the Russians and the Americans and the Indians and Pakistanis and others, going back to this notion of back channels, I hope that there's a way for those countries to talk to each other in a quiet place away from the cacophony of noise that now fills the public space in a way that that kind of noise didn't overwhelm decision makers in 1970 or 1980 or 1960.
In 1962, the greatest fear was a nuclear conflict between the two superpowers. Today, there are more opportunities for conflict to spiral out of control in smaller nations with entrenched animosities toward each other. The challenges from a rogue state like North Korea, a regional conflict in India and Pakistan, or a possible attack by terrorists using a smaller device known as a dirty bomb somewhere in the world are just a sampling of threats today's national security officials face. Even in countries without weapons, the existence of more nuclear power plants in unstable regions could result in a potential catastrophic disaster.
But you also have the additional terrible danger of nuclear weapons being used, either intentionally or unintentionally, or nuclear accidents involving, quite apart from the nuclear weapons, Ukraine is filled with nuclear power plants, including the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And it's quite easy to imagine a accident involving one of those nuclear power plants.
Tonight, fears of a nuclear catastrophe at Europe's largest nuclear plant in Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine, are intensifying. Now, Ukraine is warning that Russia may take the plant off the electrical grid, a precarious move that energy experts say raises the risk of a nuclear accident, sending radioactive material across Europe.
The bottom line is that, for all these regional conflicts that we witnessed around the world, we're now back to a situation where the country that actually was the biggest source of worry to the United States throughout the Cold War has again emerged as the main threat to the United States. In other words, Russia.
Frederick Logval says historians' opinions have evolved on how President Kennedy handled Nikita Khrushchev's atomic gambit 60 years ago.
I think it has evolved, or it's gone in cycles. I think some of the early literature was highly complimentary to John F. Kennedy. He caused the Soviets to blink. He caused the Soviets to back down. This showed the sort of supremacy of the United States, showed this cool commander-in-chief who made these decisions. Later, I think there was a wave of what we might call revisionist literature, which not only on this issue but on lots of other issues tended to be highly critical of John F. Kennedy, not least in foreign policy, who saw him as this kind of aggressive cold warrior who was chomping at the bit to take it to the communists wherever they might appear, and who caused the missile crisis, which is arguably quite true. The United States certainly helped to bring this crisis on with its efforts against Castro in particular, to try to oust him from power.
While the White House tapes and declassified documents reveal that the president shared in the responsibility for forcing Khrushchev's hand in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Logval says his successful resolution of the crisis to keep the world from nuclear Armageddon is inarguable.
And I think, for me, it's hard to argue against, based on all the evidence we now have, tapes, documents, oral histories. It's hard, for me at least, to argue against the notion that John F. Kennedy, the moment of maximum danger, handled this crisis, it seems to me, extremely well.
Nina Khrushcheva, Khrushchev's granddaughter, says both leaders succeeded in the best way possible. They kept the world from spinning out of control into a global nuclear disaster.
They both won, in a sense. Khrushchev decided that for him, humanity and caring for humanity, because, and I mean, it sounds grand, but I do think that world fates, he knew that he was very rash in making this decision, but world fate mattered to him. And so he, kind of unwound this crisis together with JFK.
But while the success benefited Kennedy almost immediately and helped enshrine his legacy as a peacemaker, Khrushchev's legacy has been more complicated. For the man who found a way to broker the peace with the U.S. in 1962, he wouldn't have his success recognized by his party until another reformer, Mikhail Gorbachev, came to power. According to Khrushcheva, Gorbachev was the first leader to speak positively about Khrushchev's legacy. He said the Soviet premier in 1962 ensured the Soviet Union would be respected in any nuclear talks for decades after the crisis.
That the Russian way of looking at it is that America stopped being as cocky as it was with the Soviet Union for quite some time, which was also an important thing. I mean, it would really dealt with the Soviet Union on much more kind of even basis, that parity that Khrushchev always wanted.
Today in Russia, Khrushchev remains a controversial figure. According to Khrushcheva, Vladimir Putin, the ex-KGB and Stalinist Russian leader, views Khrushchev's anti-Stalin position and efforts at reform as weak. For Putin and other Russian hardliners, the 1962 agreement between Khrushchev and Kennedy was an embarrassing capitulation. Meanwhile, Khrushcheva says opponents of Putin in the war in Ukraine view Khrushchev's handling of the crisis as a positive example for Russian politics.
So it's, once again, it depends on the audience. For many, independent thinkers or liberal thinkers or deeply anti-Putin thinkers or deeply anti-war in Ukraine thinkers think that now, once again, they're rethinking the Cuban Missile Crisis as something that, the current administration really should look into, which of course it wouldn't.
While there are more nuclear actors today than in 1962, the Russian Federation still has the largest arsenal, with nearly 6,000 nuclear weapons, according to the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Despite Russia's threat as the country with the largest nuclear arsenal, historian Michael Dobbs says world leaders failed to successfully incorporate it into the global community after the end of the Cold War.
And now we're seeing, another terrible war in Ukraine, and the risk of a nuclear exchange and possibility of nuclear weapons being used. And although one can put sort of 80-90% of the blame for what's happened on President Putin and the Russian leadership, I think that it's a failure of statesmanship all around, and we're seeing the results of those mistakes now.
As of October 2022, the Ukraine crisis continues with widespread fears among the U.S. and its allies that President Putin may use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Michael Dobbs highlights that the situation in Ukraine is a lot like Cuba, where the environment is fluid and unpredictable, and could spiral out of control under the best of circumstances.
And that, to me, is the real lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that, once you go to war and you put your forces on alert, even leaders that are rational and supposedly control their militaries, they're actually not in control of everything. And all sorts of, undesirable consequences can happen without either the leader of Russia or the leader of the United States desiring them to happen.
Dobbs sees some clear differences between Kennedy and Khrushchev and Biden and Putin.
Current day leaders don't have that same experience. I mean, even Biden, personally, he's, was never in the military. And President Putin certainly doesn't have that same gut feeling about the risk of war that even Soviet leaders had, and particularly Khrushchev had. So I think that Putin is in some ways, Khrushchev was unpredictable, but Putin is even more unpredictable than Khrushchev was.
Tom Nichols says while the two superpowers could somewhat predict the other's responses during the Cold War, there's not that same predictability in today's conflicts.
I worry a lot that Vladimir Putin will make a terrible miscalculation because of his involvement in a large regional conflict in the middle of Europe, which is a different matter entirely. I think that the biggest threat to our existence right now does not lie in big ideological conflicts, but in the smallness of human stupidity.
And unlike in the Cold War, he says the American people today appear to have lost the sense of what a nuclear conflict could mean for them.
I think what's different is that the public does not have a firm understanding anymore of what's involved with the use of nuclear weapons. I think Americans in particular have lived through 30 years where American power has been almost supreme in the world. And they haven't really had to think about bomb drills and fallout shelters and, stocking water and radios and things like that. And I think Americans just don't have a really firm sense of what it means to think about the use of nuclear weapons.
For the first time since the end of the Cold War, the United States and the rest of the world could have to confront the sober reality of a potential 21st century nuclear conflict. In our next and final episode, we'll ask experts in national security, journalism, and U.S.-Russia relations to reflect on the questions ahead, including, how can we learn from Cuba in today's crisis in Ukraine?
When we think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was really Khrushchev versus Kennedy, right? It was very much seen as a direct confrontation. It's not the same confrontation where you have two people looking at each other and one has to blink, right? I think we're in a much more complicated situation here.
The lines of communication are essential here. If things are going to escalate, you want to be damn sure that's not a mistake. So you need to talk. You need to have those communication lines, as was the case throughout the Cuban Missile Crisis.
How does today's society differ from the one in 1962?
I think one of the big differences from the Cuban Missile Crisis is that there wasn't the weaponization of the media that there is today.
The glaring, elephant in the room, if you will, is our own political division and dysfunction right now, which just makes it that much harder to prepare people for things.
And what does it take for today's leaders to avoid disaster?
Even when you've got what appears to be a deathly serious and dangerous confrontation, there is a way out if the leaders are willing to contemplate that and to take some political risk and make the hard decisions.
Lastly, if world leaders need a playbook for peace, they should look back at JFK's American University speech and how he laid out his hope for negotiating a global peace.
I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Atomic Gambit. Along with Matt Porter and myself, Jamie Richardson, Atomic Gambit is made possible with help from our co-producer Rick King and supervising producer Valerie Linson. Thank you to our research assistants Sarah LaRusi and Megan McKee, and our independent fact-checker Ben Schaefer. Thank you to the JFK Library's archive staff for assistance with researching and digitizing additional material. We also want to thank the Miller Center at the University of Virginia for providing the recordings of the White House tapes used in the series. A special thank you to Ambassador Caroline Kennedy for permission to use audio from Jacqueline Kennedy's 1964 oral history interview. Our music is composed by Premium Beat, and podcast artwork is provided by Brian Kang. We also thank all of our guests for lending their voices and expertise to this podcast.